Hello everybody and welcome to Mosse on a Monday for Christmas. I have my Christmas jumper on, the tree is up, the lights are on. Usually, as you know, the deal is that I do 2 non-fiction and 2 fiction that I pluck from my bookshelves. But because it's Christmas, I decided this time I was simply going to share some of the very best winter and Christmas stories with you. So I'm going to start, of course, with my old favourite, Dame Agatha Christie, the Queen of Crime. And the publishing used to be, in the old days, a Christie for Christmas, so it's very appropriate. And this one is, you can see, my battered old edition, Hercule Poirot's Christmas. Now, this came out in 1938, and it has all the hallmarks, both of Christie, of course, but a Christmas story. And everybody is going home to an old country house. It's cold, it's Christmas. Simeon Lee is a terrible, despicable old man who bullies his children. Some of them are estranged, some of them are not. And then there are 2 people, Stephen Farr and Pilar, who meet on a train going down, and they look exotic and different. He's come from South Africa, and she is partly Spanish, and they discover that they are going to the same place. And a brilliant detective story unravels in this of missing wills, lost people from the past, people who are pretending to be other people, people born on the wrong side of the blanket, as they would have said in the 1930s. And in the middle of this is Hercule Poirot, who is very offended, if you like, that there is a murder, but nothing's quite what it seems. He feels that he's kind of been set up, if you like. I'm not going to tell you anything more about it, because this is a quick canter through some of the best Christmas stories, but if you've not read it before, Hercule Poirot's Christmas, it will get your Christmas off to a good start. And if you think you've got family problems, think about the Lee family. Now, my second choice isn't strictly Christmas, but it is winter, and not everybody celebrates Christmas anyway, so I thought I would do some winter stories. And what better, I suppose what better when everybody's round the fire, if you're in a cold country for Christmas, than good old-fashioned ghost stories. And there's nobody much better than the great M.R. James. He was an extraordinary ghost story writer of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And he had a tradition. He was the provost of King's College, Cambridge, and he also was in charge of Eton. And what he would do is write a story for Christmas Eve and gather all his friends round, and he would stand, I imagine he stood in front of the fireplace, but because these are the days before central heating, and then would read for his close friends and some of the masters and maybe even some of the pupils who were there, the new Christmas story. What I love about M.R. James' ghost stories is that they very much belong to what I would think of as the winter Christian tradition. The idea of people gathering as the darkness comes outside, thinking about ghosts, thinking about pagan stories, thinking about old religious stories. Everything about M.R. James is based in both theology but also folklore. And he covers a huge range of places. So in this collection, which you can see, this is my old edition that belonged to somebody called J.V.H. Scales. I bought in a second-hand bookshop. I don't know if you can see the date that he bought this, 1947. But here there are many, this edition came out in 1931. There are some of the very famous stories like Canon Albrecht's Scrapbook, which is set in the Pyrenees, not far from Toulouse. There's Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which of course is set on the Suffolk coast. There's a really terrifying story called The Ash Tree, which builds on the terrible witch hunter trials of East Anglia and is set near Bury St Edmunds. And then there are stories such as number 13, which is set in Jutland in Denmark, others that are set in Stockholm. So he very much uses place as a driver and a mechanism for the ghost stories. I'm not going to tell you any of the stories because there's nothing quite so boring as somebody actually trying to tell you a story. But what I do love, I'm just going to leave you with this. If you've not read M.R. James, he really is great. Montague James, he was. But he was always being asked if he believed in ghosts. Now, I write ghost stories. Some of you might have read The Winter Ghost, or you might have read The Taxidermist's Daughter, or some of my historical fiction that has a more mystical element, Mistletoe Bride and other short stories. And it's the question you're always asked, and I love this answer from Omar James. Do I believe in ghosts? To which I answer that I am prepared to consider evidence and accept it if it satisfies me. So these are wonderfully satisfying ghost stories, perfect for winter, and when you read them, just imagine what it must have been like to be there in his study in King's College, Cambridge, or in Eton, where a piece of paper came out and he stood up to read a brand new Christmas ghost story for the first time. Now, my next selection is also a collection of short stories. And you might have noticed that I haven't mentioned publishers so far because I'm sharing my very old battered editions, and that's going to continue. But I will mention that this is a beautiful series from the wonderful independent publisher Profile Books. And they have many. This one is Murder on a Winter's Night, but they also have Murder at Christmas, Murder Under the Christmas Tree, Murder on Christmas Eve. And this is just a collection of some of the great stories gathered about winter and Christmas. And it includes Cyril Hare, Margery Allingham, Dorothy L. Sayers, Mark Billingham, Arthur Conan Doyle, Edmund Crispin. And they just are exactly what you want from a winter's story, if you like, which is the setup, the explanation, the murder, the round the fireplace announcement of whodunit, and then bam. They're all very, very short and succinct and come from all sorts of times in history, mostly the 20th century, of course. But the one that I wanted to pick out particularly, because apart from anything else, I love her crime writing, but I also love this wonderful, wonderful title, which is The Undignified Melodrama of the Bone of Contention by Dorothy L. Sayers. Now this particular one, it starts in a very, very Dorothy L. Sayers way. You will know Lord Peter Wimsey is her toff detective. My favourite of her crime stories really are the ones that involve Harriet Vane, who is a writer, and a great deal of Dorothy L. Sayers I think she put into Harriet Vane and what it was like to be a woman successful as a writer in a world of men. But Lord Peter Wimsey, as you might know, he kind of walks around with his monocle, he's super posh, and he behaves, like an ass. That's how it's always described. But at the same time, he always works the puzzle out. And it's partly because people underestimate him, rather like my beloved Miss Marple. He's underestimated because he sounds and looks a rather chinless wonder, but he's not. This particular story has absolutely everything you want from a melodramatic ghost story. But is it a ghost story? Well, there are headless horsemen. There are riders going through the night. There's glowing steeds that are white. There's a particular place which probably was where the old gibbet was in this village, where no horses or animals would go past. And all that has happened is yet another reprehensible old man has died. He has two sons surviving. Another has died in the war, the First World War, and one of those sons, Martin, is estranged and has walked out and leaving his father to rue the day that he ever let him be a son of his. There's a great deal of that melodramatic sort of that goes on. But actually it's an incredibly ingenious story of a lost will about a strange codicil to a will, which means that if the body is laid to rest in the ground before a certain time, then somebody will inherit. And if it isn't, it stays above ground and somebody else inherits. So actually this is a grave robbing story, really. And the ghost elements are all red herrings. Another one of Dorothy L. Sayers' books was, of course, 5 red herrings. So it's one of my favourites in the book. It's quite a long short story. I'd say it's about 8,000 words. But this beautiful series of books, you can buy all of them in one go, and they are just exactly what you want. When you don't have that much time, but you can just dip in and dip out. Perfect. So this is Murder on a Winter's Night, published by Profile Books, 10 classic short stories. Now, where else to finish but with possibly the greatest Christmas story, no, not that one, of all time, and that is Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which first published on the 19th of December in 1843. It's only 66 pages long, and it's really never been out of print since. It's had children's versions, it's had many, many film versions, not least of all the classic, as we all know, The Muppets Christmas Carol. And they are there are so many characters in this tiny, tiny novel, really, that have stepped out into the world off the pages of the book, not least of all Scrooge. One of the best lines of all time, Marley was dead, to begin with. What an opening. Now, you can see, this is yet another one of my very old editions, and you can see the tiny, tiny, tiny print here. Collection of short stories, and of course Charles Dickens wrote quite a lot of other Christmas short stories. But bear with me, many of you might not actually ever have read it. And it is the most exquisite and cleverly put together story, because not only does it have a very strong moral message, this was of course about poverty and the injustice of Victorian Christian society that would see children starving on the streets and would throw men and women into the debtor's prison, and of course Dickens himself has had his own experience of that. But it is also what a Christmas story should be about, and it's about redemption, about the idea that it is never too late to turn over a new leaf. And so it begins, Marley was dead, and Scrooge has worked with Marley and for Marley, and Marley, his old partner, and they're misers. And of course we have that with the idea of Scrooge as the miser, everybody understands that. And the lovely family that works for him, Bob Cratchit, and his children who are very happy but underfed and very poor. And of course you know the story, but it's different when you read it on the page, the idea of the ghosts of Christmas who are going to come and visit him, and he's going to see the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And then the really sad ending when this man sees what his life will be like if he continues like this. And he changes. And he starts to celebrate Christmas, and he walks through the street and he gets the biggest turkey and he goes and gives it to the Cratchit family. And in this story, Tiny Tim, the young disabled boy, does not have the ending that he has in Christmas Yet to Come, and everything is redeemed. And I love that. I read it every year as the sense of Christmas, the spirit of goodwill. And of course it ends, I'm just double checking because it always changes, but it is that wonderful thing. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. So if you've not read it, you really can't do better than reading A Christmas Carol this Christmas. So there are so many collections, different ones. My old faithful one, because it has lost its backboards, and there's water stained. I got this from a second-hand bookshop. But there's something about reading a very old book and holding that weight in your hands and thinking of all the other people who've read this version of A Christmas Carol at Christmas. So that's it for this year's Mosse on a Monday. Thank you, all of you, for joining me, for saying how much you enjoy the recommendations, most of all for buying the books and keeping authors going to write another story. I mean, many of the authors I've chosen, of course, are no longer with us, but many of them are writers writing now, and it makes all the difference. It doesn't matter whether you, I was going to say beg, borrow or steal, but maybe let's just say we buy and borrow a book. It doesn't matter what you're reading, just enjoy it, and if you have enjoyed it, passing on. Now, I'll be back next year for Mosse on a Monday. Some of you will know that I'm going to be doing my own version of Dickens, if you like. I'm going to be taking a one-woman show on the road, and of course that's really how most people knew Charles Dickens, from his one-man shows travelling not only the UK but very much in America and reading his stories out loud. So I'm going to be preparing that and also working on my next novel, The Ghost Ship, which will come out in July. But in the end, like you, I'm a reader, and I can't imagine not wanting to share some of the books that I'm loving or have loved in the past with you. So have a fantastic Christmas, however you celebrate it, wherever you are in the world. Have a wonderful new year, and God bless us, everyone. Bye for now.